Before we begin, I'd like to ask that we all take a moment of silence in the memory of Tyree Nichols and all the victims of violence and oppression, both named and unnamed. Thank you. Thank you. Well, hello and welcome. I'm going to do my best to make a transition. It's a privilege to be with all of you today, back in person after 2 years of wandering the virtual wilderness. I see a lot of familiar faces, but it has been a minute, so introductions are probably warranted. My name is Chad D'Entremont. I am the Executive Director at the Rennie Center for Education Research and Policy. Our mission is to ensure that education decision-making is based on deep knowledge and evidence of effective policymaking and practice, with a primary focus on Massachusetts. Each year, as part of this work, we examine the condition of education in the Commonwealth. We seek to raise up and share local successes, confront and combat persistent challenges rooted in system inequities, and present to policymakers in the field actionable strategies that can drive immediate improvements in teaching and learning. This work culminates in January during what we call COE Week, C-O-E Week, a week-long set of activities designed to center conversation and spur action on the most pressing issues of the year. This year is a bit special for us. It marks our 10th anniversary. Over the past decade, we have examined dozens of programs and communities on issues ranging from early childhood to early college and beyond. This vast library provides an opportunity to reflect on some of the most promising strategies from across the state for improving student outcomes, and some of the ways their examples challenge us to rethink approaches to education that simply don't seem to be working for all students. Our hope today is to engage you in this work, to hear from state leaders about their priorities for the year, and chart a way forward as we all strive to recover from the pandemic. As you can see on today's agenda, and if that's a bit hard to read, you have the agenda in your packets on your chairs. We will shortly hear from the new Massachusetts Secretary of Education, Patrick Tutwiler, followed I did note that was quite an experience before the event started. I thought I was at a wedding. There was like a full receiving line. This will be followed by a presentation of where the Rennie Center will talk to you all about where we see the future of education, and then a conversation with our 3 state education commissioners, and an opportunity for them to correct us on everything we probably got wrong. We have some big ideas on how to move forward, but we know that progress only comes from aligning our efforts and working in partnership. That's why I have always thought it's what Rennie does best: share research, elevate local practices to build connections across the education landscape that can lead to lasting improvements. I hope you hear some things today that you'll think about joining us and working on, and I can't wait to get started. But before we begin, a few thank yous. First, I want to acknowledge and thank some of our guests and supporters. I want to acknowledge Representative Peisch, Representative Vieira, Senator Jalen, and Boston Superintendent Mary Skipper, who are either here today or have been critical to helping us bring this work together. I want to thank the Rennie Center's funders, especially the Barr Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and the Davis Foundation, which have all provided resources to support COE. I want to thank the Rennie Center Board for their guidance and leadership, including our chair, Celine Coggins, Lori Brennan, Jessica Boston Davis, Pam Edinger, Roger Krakoff, and Paul Rebel. And perhaps most especially, I want to thank the Rennie Center team. This work would not be possible without the efforts of everyone at the Rennie Center. Our Deputy Director, a few special shout-outs. Our Deputy Director, Laura DeJourney, without whom nothing at the Rennie Center would ever happen. Rennie associate Megan Volsey and Rennie researcher Erica Lee, who both worked on the data and improvement strategies you'll see in the reports that we're putting out. Rennie Director of Communications, Catherine Rossio. Former Rennie Senior Associate Sophie Zamarripa, who helped guide COE before her departure, going on to bigger and better things, and we couldn't be more excited for her. And especially our Director of Policy, Alexis Leon, who you will hear from today. Alexis has worked tirelessly to see the vision of this year's report be fully realized. Her remarkable ability to bring broad ideas and forge connections to policies and strategies that can drive change will be felt today and has created a strong foundation for the work that I believe lies ahead at the Rennie Center. Alexis, wherever you are, I am very, very thankful. Appreciate it. She also does it top to bottom. No one saw her here yesterday laying out things on chairs and putting out name tags, so much appreciated. All right, with that, let's get started. We have a grand tradition here of not going heavy on bios. You all have bios in your packets, and I encourage you to read them. As I bring Secretary Tutwiler to the stage, I want to acknowledge his great work in Lynn Public Schools, his recent efforts at the Barr Foundation, and make particular note of this seminal moment in our education system to have him standing before us as a leader setting a direction for public education in Massachusetts. Secretary Tutwiler, thank you very much.
Good morning. Oh, great. Chad warmed them up for me. Again, I am Pat Tutwiler, and it is thrilled to be with you here this morning. This is actually my first time attending this event, and as luck would have it, I actually get to speak at my first time attending. So quickly, last week, I had a planning meeting with the good people at the Rennie Center, and in that planning meeting, they told me to plan to speak for about 10 minutes. Immediately, this ask, 10 minutes, put me at odds with my tried and true formula for speech making. It's something that folks who know me well know, something I call my 3B formula. That is, be good, be brief, and be seated. So, Rennie family, I am sorry. I'm not gonna go long, it's not my style, but you can count on me being brief, and I plan to be seated upon completion. The good part, you be the judge. I'm a big believer in the idea that you can't separate ideas from the person. So before I offer a few ideas, a few thoughts, it's best that you know just a little bit about me beyond what you can see in your program. I was raised by my mother in a single-parent household along with my older brother. I spent a good part of my early years moving a lot, Chicago to Champaign in Illinois, Austin, Texas, St. Paul, Minnesota, and then ultimately to Massachusetts for college and beyond. All of the moves in my early life were related to my mother's professional journey as an educator, teaching for many years in Illinois, earning a doctorate at the University of Texas, and then back to the classroom teaching teachers in St. Paul. My mother's path as an educator grew right alongside her path as a mother, and it became our journey. And along the way, my brother and I, we watched very closely. With a deep knowledge of an educator but fierce love of a mother, we watched her fight for my brother and me to ensure that we had the best possible education, no matter what state we found ourselves. We watched her safeguard our potential, respectfully disagree about our placements, labels even, that might otherwise have attached themselves not only to our transcripts, but internally to the view that we had of ourselves as learners. We watched her type a dissertation on a typewriter. We watched. These experiences inform who I am as an educator in so many ways, an educator who operates from a firm set of values, the core of which is love for our students. That matters. An educator who seeks to listen and understand the stories and experiences of students and families because I know having that understanding validating those experiences is key to a successful partnership. An educational leader who will respectfully and almost never apologetically disagree when a decision does not center our students in their best interest at the core, because that matters. An educator who feels strongly that the mark of a thriving and healthy school is its ability to reach and elevate its most underserved student population. I said I wouldn't go on long here, and I'm not planning to. I'll leave it there, but I thought it important to share a little bit with you about who's speaking to you this morning, because that matters. This morning's question, how might we rethink school? Now, I'm 18 days, not that I'm counting, into the new administration. It might be a little premature to talk concretely about investments, enhancements, policy, and the like. There'll be time for that for sure, really soon. Today, I want to offer an opinion. As the Secretary of Education, I think mine counts for something now. At least that's what they told me. Along with my opinion, I'd like to offer a framework, a guideline for contemplating, reflecting on this big and important question. In 2020, we had to reimagine, reinvent, rethink school in the most literal ways under unprecedented and often emergent circumstances. That experience, traumatic to so many, could result in real exhaustion and resistance to the idea of any more rethinking school. As we feel the natural pull and desire to follow the siren song of return to normal. So to me, it's important that we challenge ourselves with this important moment, this important question in this moment. In order to rethink school, it's crucial to first reflect, to contemplate where we are, not only the impact the pandemic visited on our schools and the learners and families they serve, but also the pre-existing inequities that the pandemic exacerbated. Where we are starting from and how we got there are important to the discussion of where we're going. As we allow our experience and imagination to collaborate to rethink school, to transform, it's critical that we first stabilize and heal. Stabilize, heal, transform. In my final year as superintendent in Lynn, as we began the first steps of emerging from the pandemic, stabilize, heal, transform became the theme that captured the work that we needed to do in partnership with our families and the broader community. In my experience, particularly when leading through a challenging issue and a challenging time, when big ideas and strategy are winnowed down to simple concepts, a theme, they become giant puzzle pieces that folks can easily see fitting together. In thoughtful consultation with community leaders and stakeholders, the theme was stabilize, heal, transform. Stabilize, heal, transform. I submit to you that this theme may serve as our framework for rethinking school. The use of the words stabilize and heal are deeply intentional and designed to convey that we are still in a recovery period. We're not back. There are two major areas where we continue to experience great challenge, both of which we must address if we are to stabilize and heal. Both are enabling conditions and the foundation to sustained transformation: staffing and mental health. Someone agrees. In church, we say amen, but you can just say, yep, that's fine. Staffing and education took a hit at the hands of the pandemic, no revelation there. We're now at a critical place, and this challenge is felt in early education, K-12, and higher ed alike. There are many, many unfilled positions in K-12 in Massachusetts, including the critical areas such as special education. While the emergency license has been an invaluable stopgap, it is evident that educators serving with this credential are also in critical need of support and training. In early education, there are on average a little more than 3 unfilled teaching positions per center. Filling these positions would provide early education services for an additional 10,000 or more students. The struggle is real, but we have the means to address it over time. I happen to believe that one of our richest resources are current high school students. Expanding early college will provide clear, affordable pathway for high school students and their entree to the greatest professional calling. Expansion of early college will not only meet the goal of inviting more young professionals in number down the same professional path my mother and I have traveled, but it will serve to diversify our body of educators. I'm deeply committed to increasing the racial and linguistic diversity of our teaching staff. Given where early college has taken an early stakehold thus far in some of our most diverse school districts, there's real potential there. How do we attract people to our professional lane with extraordinary need and excuse me, I've got you can hear the raspiness here. Let me take a moment, as they say. How do we attract people to our professional lane with extraordinary need and incredible rewards? We must acknowledge the need to partner with each other to improve the narrative around the profession. We all went through a scary time together and we're working our way back together, and it's hard. How can we shift the narrative to be an all call for the best and brightest? How can we all partner to sound the alarm, attracting people to want to be part of the solution, who want to inspire the next core of leaders and thinkers? How can we elevate the stories of how the profession continues to evolve and how schools continue to be ideas places, where innovation and creativity happen in the purest form? Somehow, some way, the narrative has to change. It has to improve. Once we attract future educators to this calling, we must make it possible by making it affordable. This can be done in one of many ways by leveraging more robustly existing early ed career pathways partnerships with community colleges and rethinking financial aid altogether. These are just a couple of strategies that will yield results and already have momentum. There are several more for sure. The past 2 years has really underscored the close relationship between well-being and learning, and perhaps most importantly, the need for a mindset shift to understanding dysregulated behavior as a manifestation of an unmet need. The last 2 years have also underscored the need for a robust, multi-tiered system of support in schools. In speaking to educators and leaders, the challenge persists in profound ways, both in dysregulated behaviors, but also in one of the biggest manifestations, absenteeism. Early ed providers, teachers and leaders in the K-12 space, and even post-secondary educators and leaders must continue to prioritize mental health in the forefront. We have to keep mental health in the forefront. We're not there yet. Triage in the current context, as we are still in recovery, and then development of sustained and robust multi-tiered systems is a strong path toward healing. Having just left the role of superintendent some 4 months ago, I'm deeply familiar with the present-day challenges schools and care providers experience, particularly in the urban setting. And at the same time, I feel incredible optimism around our ability to meet these challenges. Stabilize, heal, transform. By transform, I refer in part to the evolution that happened in profound ways on all levels over the past 2.5 years. Although I would say that the substance and depth of these evolutions reflect the early markers of transformation. Change does not equal transformation. For example, I see real value in the extraordinary increase in technology with new and different equipment and platforms across all levels. But I'm talking more about how these things are used and what behaviors and even beliefs are changed as a result. This is the beginning, and we have to ask ourselves, have we transformed our students' educational experiences to be everything we can imagine and everything they deserve? Committing to transformation is the heart of what we should be about. The commitment doesn't have a definitive end per se, but I believe we're at the doorstep of some unique transformational opportunities. Opportunities to rethink school. What does that look like? A couple of examples. It looks like significantly expanded opportunities for early childhood education. We know full well the multiple benefits for our youngest learners and the workforce. And with that expansion, deepened partnerships between early education providers and elementary educators on foundational literacy skills and kindergarten readiness. It involves reimagining high school in the state of Massachusetts. I said it. It involves the expansion of early college, innovation pathways, and programs like After Dark, which provides expanded access to vocational programming, are significant pieces, but I think we need to go further. I see the implementation of those initiatives not as add-ons, but rather an invitation to think more broadly about the high school experience. I think we need to rethink and subsequently redesign high schools, putting students at the center and design from there. What would it look like to design a high school putting the needs of students with special needs or newcomers first? Does the traditional bell-to-bell high school day serve students whose hierarchy of need call for them to work long hours after school? Does the current structure match the kinds of engagement needs that we know our students have? Is it flexible enough to embrace authentic learning experiences and opportunities? Stabilize, heal, transform. Each piece of this framework is important in its own right, and each is a piece to the giant puzzle of addressing our duty to serve the educational needs of all students in our state and ensure their right to the best education they can imagine for themselves. Now, a long time ago, long time ago, I played basketball. I know it doesn't look like it now. After every timeout in our games, we used to break the huddle with a clap of the hands and a shout of the word together. Cliche maybe, embarrassing a little, but the meaning behind it isn't. We said that because it was only through togetherness that we would achieve something. It was only through individual contributions to a collective mission that we would be successful. When I think of the challenges we had and those we will encounter, my friends, the need for togetherness is in this mission is profound. On this day, perhaps we should proceed in the same way that we made collective commitments on my college basketball team a long time ago. Now, bear with me here. On the count of 3, let's give a big shout together. You ready? I see a lot of folks looking at their phones. You're not ready. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Together. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Tutwiler. I think we're in good hands. It's a rare talent to have someone who can touch your heart and still stay on schedule. So thank you very much. Stabilize, heal, transform. Our communications team should have spoken to you before the event. That's good taglines. But hopefully we are so well aligned in our thinking that yesterday we released our retrospective action guide, elevating programs we've looked at over the past 10 years whose specific strategies are in the executive summary you have in front of you. And I encourage you to click on the QR code after this event and read more about the programs themselves. And they exemplify some of best practices and how right now we can stabilize and heal. But they also create a very strong foundation by thinking about how we can transform and where we need to go next. And my hope is over the next few minutes, myself and Alexis can offer some additional thoughts to what the Secretary shared and what we're so aligned on. If I can step back for a minute, in 1993, more than a generation ago, around the time Massachusetts passed landmark legislation to improve public education in our schools, AT&T ran a series of commercials imagining a brighter, ever-evolving, and interconnected future. For those old enough, you might remember they were narrated by Tom Selleck. For those of you who are younger, that's Monica's dashing older boyfriend, the guy with the big mustache on Friends. And the commercials predicted a number of scenarios that would fundamentally change how we navigate the world, along with ideas such as getting directions directly from your car, or joining a work meeting from a sunlit porch, or amazingly, watching a movie on your TV exactly when you wanted to see it. The commercials also hinted at how fundamentally changing the ways we communicate would affect learning. This could mean joining a class taking place thousands of miles away, or getting immediate feedback from experts in a field of study, or building new relationships across language and cultural barriers. I was in high school at the time, and this world that was being shown seemed fantastical, but it also seemed utterly possible. As technology both shrank and expanded the world around me, applying the possibilities of what it offered to the accepted routines of daily life seemed like a logical next step. Someone just had to present the ideas and point the way. I know right now seems like an odd time to talk about transformation. It seems like a hard time to think about the fantastical. We're in the fourth year of a global pandemic. Families and communities continue to grapple with tremendous challenges, especially those communities that have been historically marginalized and under-resourced. And schools and educators working on society's front lines have often borne the brunt of responding to these challenges. On Thursday, we will release our full data report for 2023, and the findings, they're alarming. For example, chronic absenteeism has jumped nearly a quarter for all students each year since the onset of the pandemic. This includes 2022 when schools were fully back in session. Last year, 42% of all Hispanic Latino students and approximately 1/3 of all Black African American students were chronically absent from school. And as has been well reported, academic achievement has significantly declined. Proficiency in 8th grade math among all students now sits at 36%. Just over 1/3 are showing competency in grade level content, 13 percentage points below a high of 2018. And finally, fewer and fewer students are planning to go to college. Now, while increased diversity in students' post-secondary plans might not actually be a bad thing, but declining college enrollments at a time of rising tuition and economic uncertainty is cause for concern. As we all struggle to engage students, accelerate learning, and address the unprecedented mental health crisis, this work can seem overwhelming. It can be difficult to imagine a better way. And this is perhaps a reason why there are so many calls by parents and politicians and the public to return to normal, to recover the stability and consistency felt before the pandemic by once again sending students to the same place at the same time each day so they can learn and grow. But from the Rennie Center's opinion, we can't go back. I'd offer two core reasons. First, the old way was not working. While the pandemic has exacerbated many problems in our education system, it did not cause them. As demonstrated by the graphs, before the pandemic, less than half of all 8th grade students were proficient in math, and far too many were disengaged from school with no plan for what was next. As a state, we have long struggled to fulfill our promise to educate all students, and we all bear responsibility. And for students facing systemic racism or economic hardship or who are neurodiverse learners, putting back the old system often simply means rebuilding the same barriers that denied them opportunities in the first place. Second, the world has changed. The fantastic ideas described a generation ago by Magnum PI, where information and human connections flowed freely, unrestricted by space or time, this is the world we now live in. And it is the only world our students have ever known. It is our education system that is now a relic of the past, structured according to an industrial age with principles for treating children developing like they're widgets on an assembly line. The longer we take to acknowledge this and develop approaches to learning that match how our children and youth navigate their daily lives, the further we will fall behind. The world will continue to change, and we can't stop it. Looking backward is not a plan for moving forward. And it's not our intent with this year's action guide or its title. It is only a reference point so we can better see how far we've come and where we need to go. I want to ask your indulgence for a short personal story. It's one I shared in a more intimate setting a few weeks ago, and at the urging of some friends, I was encouraged to share it today. My youngest daughter is dyslexic. She's also brilliant. We call it her superpower. She's a puzzle and Lego master. She loves to play this block game where you race to be the first person to build an image on a card, and you ding a bell, and if you're first, you get the card. First to 10 wins. It's basically an old school IQ test. She loves to play with me because she beats me like a drum. And truth be told, I do think I'm pretty smart. However, school can be difficult. It can be frustrating when lessons are taught in ways that don't match how her mind works, and embarrassing when she's reading in class. Last year in 4th grade, she had an amazing teacher. This woman understood my daughter. She emphasized hands-on learning, loved exploration in science, set up spaces in the classroom where all students, not just my daughter, could find resources and materials that matched their strengths and how they learn. In my daughter's own words, it was the first time she felt smart in school. Last December, a year ago, her teacher passed away from COVID. It was extremely difficult. The entire school community suffered. And for my daughter, she not only lost a loved one, but she lost that special learning environment that she felt that had been created just for her. For the remainder of the year, the class that she was in just experienced a revolving door of substitutes, as the school understandably struggled to find anyone to sit in a classroom during a nationwide teacher shortage. In sharing this story, I do want to acknowledge my privilege. I do not face systemic bias or racism, and I have financial means. During this time, I was never really worried about my daughter's academic achievement. But I do think I experienced a feeling we've all felt over the past few years. I worried about her well-being. I worried about her engagement in school. I worried about her joy for learning. Mostly, I had a lot of questions. And as time moved on, I was struck by how lucky my daughter had been to have had the right teacher, and how tragic it was when this relationship was lost. Why, as a student, do you get assigned a teacher at the beginning of the year and just hope it works out? Especially when there are so many accomplished, passionate, and willing adults in schools and throughout students' lives. No child's education should be based on luck. I do want to be clear. This is not a story about assigning blame. I absolutely do not blame my daughter's school. They're wonderful. They were dealing with a once-in-a-generation crisis, and the school responded in the way it was able to, and how I believe most schools would. And I know there are countless teachers out there, just like the one my daughter had, who are making a difference. I want to share this experience because I believe it highlights some basic questions that we can all take action on to address the limitations of an outdated model of education and make learning better for all students. This is the work the Rennie Center will pursue in the coming year. As I mentioned, our 2023 action guide is a starting point. We have carefully curated 10 years of research to lift up examples and provide guidance in responding to the current moment on how to engage families, support educators, accelerate learning, and provide holistic supports. You have in your hands the executive summary outlining those key strategies, as I mentioned. But beyond advancing good practices, I want to reiterate again, we believe these programs offer alternatives to just putting things back the way they used to be. Programs and practices that can open the door, begin a conversation, serve as a starting point, not a finished model, for conversations on rethinking education. Big questions. For example, faced with a rapidly changing workplace environment and teacher shortages, we must rethink people. We can imagine learning environments where teams of adults move freely in and out of classrooms, connecting with different size student groups around areas of specialty. And done right, I believe this would produce a much more dynamic profession for teachers themselves, where they can pursue their own interests, enjoy more flexible staffing, and develop stronger relationships with their peers. We must rethink place and embrace the brave new world that technology offers. We can imagine expanding what the basic definition of an early education and care center, or a school, or an institution of higher education means by leveraging technology to break down physical barriers to learning. One where students have easy access to a broader world and their place of residence doesn't determine the quality of their education. And we must rethink time. And finally acknowledge that child development has never occurred on a set schedule. We can imagine shifting when learning happens so it better aligns with students' development and family needs. It is more personalized, allowing students to progress at their own pace as they demonstrate competency, while ensuring support and enrichment is provided throughout the entire year, especially in the summer. One example of this type of thinking can be found in Campuses Without Walls, a pilot project, self-serving, that the Rennie Center is supporting in partnership with Boston Public Schools, the organization BUILD, and many other community partners. Currently, Campuses Without Walls leverages technology to allow teachers and students to join classes outside their home school, led by other teachers in their district, and engage in more robust and diverse offerings than would otherwise be available to them. Well, our full vision of student-directed learning hasn't yet been realized. It's easy to imagine on the slide in front of you. Campus Without Walls would allow individual students to root their learning in the full strength of the Boston community, bypassing traditional school assignment plans to engage in advanced coursework, vocational education and internships, performing arts, behavioral and mental health supports, and affinity groups while still finding comfort and stability in a home setting. And here's the thing, I don't know if it will work, but I think offering an internship or an enrichment program or an advanced class to a student is a risk I'm willing to take to see if we can redesign high schools to provide a more fulfilling and personalized experience. In a moment, I will invite our Director of Policy, Alexis Leanne, to the stage to discuss in more detail what some of the ideas I've presented might look like in practice. But before I close, I want to emphasize that the Rennie Center, that we, are not coming into this conversation with answers. Our hope is to do what we've always done at Rennie and bring people together and forge new connections while opening up space for asking questions that we can work together to solve by applying evidence and experience from the field. This time, I think we're just asking bigger questions. Thank you. Alexis.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Chad. It's so heartwarming to see so many of you in person, finally, and so many familiar faces. So as Chad and the Secretary both made clear, we are at a critical juncture in education, where we not only have the opportunity to think creatively, equitably, and urgently, but the responsibility to do so. While these ideas may seem lofty and out of reach, there are some models across the state that are beginning to do the work of rethinking people, place, and time already, not as hypothetical, lofty ideas, but as actionable change. First, the Alternative Choices in Education, or ACE program in Brookline, offers several innovative strategies to improve education for their students. For example, ACE offers a competency-based program with thematic 6-week mini courses, small multi-age advisory groups, and a learning experience that is self-paced, self-directed, and offers flexible scheduling to allow for college courses, internships, and community service projects, breaking down the physical barriers to learning between the classroom and the real world. Students in the ACE program have demonstrated a significant improvement in their academic success, improving at least 1 grade higher in all content areas than what they had earned prior to coming to ACE. Next, the Carleton Innovation School in Salem offers a creative look at what learning can look like for our younger K-5 students. Students at the Carleton are not in grade level distinctions, but rather multi-age cohorts. All students follow personalized learning plans, moving through cohorts at their own pace, dependent on mastery and skill. And since scheduling is flexible, academic specialists and support staff can ensure that students have full access to targeted supports based on individual learning needs. And finally, the Leominster Center for Excellence, a big picture learning school, is rooted in the belief that a student's entire community is their school. Students spend 2 days a week in a credit-bearing internship in an industry sector aligned with their goals. Students have control over the development of their own academic goals and benchmarks. They demonstrate their mastery through an exhibition where they present and what they've learned to their staff, parents, and mentors at the end of every trimester, redefining who is involved in the learning process from beginning to end. To learn more about some of these programs and the staff leading this innovative work, please be sure to tune in and listen to the Condition of Education Community Conversation, a big long acronym, that we will release Thursday. That can be found on the COE page of the Rennie Center website. So as a former educator myself, my gut reaction to hearing big, lofty ideas in education is to immediately pause. I vividly remember days in the classroom where even the proposition of a new system for submitting lesson plans seemed overwhelming and exhausting, and this was pre-pandemic. Educators across the Commonwealth are working tirelessly to serve students at a time when needs, academically, emotionally, and socially, have never been higher. Our hope during this COE week is to thread the needle between short and long-term needs in our education system that, while difficult, must be approached simultaneously. The Action Guide, released yesterday, provides a look back at 10 years of COE models, best practices, and relevant strategies that we feel are still applicable to practitioners at all levels working in schools and districts today. At the same time, we know that the structures and policies that are in place across the state are not serving all students and staff equitably. As you heard from Chad, seeing what's possible and achieving it are two very different things. System-wide change can feel impossible at times because it's as though we are asking, and sometimes expecting, the pilots of the plane to simultaneously serve as its mechanics. As school and district leaders manage the immediate day-to-day needs that students come to school with every day, it's up to all of us to focus on broader, systemic changes to push the Commonwealth toward a more equitable education system. In order to do this, we feel we must redefine how we discuss and approach problem-solving in education. The pandemic has proven that policy issues are not siloed by sector. For example, education and public health are inextricably linked. And solutions must embody collaboration, clear communication, and creative thinking. Rather than a constellation of bright program spots across the state that work for some students, we must begin to reimagine and intentionally work toward policies and structures that rebuild the foundation that education operates in. Over the coming year, we'll be engaging in conversations with the education community, all of you, to discuss big ideas, ask big questions, and create space for problem solving, what it will take to not just reimagine education, but to execute, implement, and produce results. So if we want to ensure that all students have access to highly effective, equitable education experiences and outcomes, we must ensure that they have access to a highly effective teaching team. In order to do this, we have to address the declining teacher workforce, inflexible work environments for educators and staff, teacher and staff burnout. We need to be asking questions like, what could it look like to reorganize school staffing to support flexible, multidisciplinary teaching teams? What policies and structures would have to change in order to support this? How can we use skill mix analysis to enable educators to work across classrooms and age groups to better meet the needs of their students? If we want to provide students with learning and creation environments that match how they navigate the modern world, that's immersive, relevant to real-world issues and opportunities, and as interconnected as their life is outside of their school building, then we have to be asking questions like, how can we incorporate a student's community in the classroom and bring the classroom into the community? How can work-based learning fit into a school day for credit and pay? What policies are preventing this or making it difficult or confusing for a student to access? And finally, if we want to ensure the academic learning environment, community supports, and career experiences that we are providing to our students align with how students spend their time in the world today, then we must be asking questions like, how can we reimagine the parameters around what currently defines learning time? If we know that learning does not cease in the hours outside of 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. or in July and August, how can we reconstruct calendars to support academic development and enrichment, such as tutoring, summer camps, and extracurriculars, basketball, so that that is valued as a critical addition to a learning experience? Our hope today and throughout 2023 is to bring together all of those in the Massachusetts education ecosystem to work toward this bigger vision collaboratively and in a way that respects and adapts to the varying needs and desires of communities all across the Commonwealth. Rather than pointing fingers at one particular group to solve these enormous challenges, we recognize that it will take all of us coming together to begin the process of systemic change, one policy and one practice at a time. And there's a role for everyone to play to achieve this vision. It is critical that we take collaborative, clear steps to move from imagining to implementation. And I really look forward to continuing that conversation with you all in the coming year. So to continue digging into these important questions today, I am delighted to turn the mic back over to Chad to introduce our commissioner panel. Thank you.
Invite our panelists to come on up to the stage. Thank you so much. I did tell everyone, right, Alexis is going to keep us honest. It can't just be big ideas. It actually has to be designed and implementable. So thank you, Alexis. As we're getting started, once again, friendly reminder, bios for our speakers are in your packets. In the interest of moving us along a little bit, which I am sure they won't mind, I just want to say that, and I've always admired this about the state, we've got 3 state leaders here with incredibly deep investment and experience in their fields. Experience working in centers, institutions, schools, programs on the ground level, all the way up to overseeing government. And I think it gives them a really important perspective for the conversation we're having. Thank you so much, commissioners. Amy, I might come to you for no other reason than we'll just sort of work from youngest to oldest.
Youngest to oldest, ladies first, whichever. Alphabetical.
But I think the basic question, which will go to all of you, is just, you heard what the secretary said, you heard what I and Alexis shared. What do you think about it? And more importantly, what are the priorities you see, in your case for early education and care? Do they align with some of these ideas, and are there areas where you might push back?
Great. Well, thanks, Chad, and thanks, Alexis, and to the Rennie Center for having us. And I also want to welcome our new secretary. I have a freshman at UMass Amherst who is studying to be a high school history teacher, and he is the first person I called when your appointment was announced. The future is bright for him. And I'm also very pleased to be here with my co-commissioners, and I think some of the transformation we seek in the future depends on us working differently and our agencies working differently together as we think about building towards the future. So it is a critical and difficult time in the early education and care space, as it is in the K-12 and higher ed, and it is also a moment of opportunity. Am I too close or too far?
Yeah. I feel like we're copying and go.
Yeah, maybe. Turn off the other ones. Okay, let's give it a, can you still hear me? Okay, great. So let me talk a little bit about the priorities, which you can't turn on the radio or open the newspaper and not hear about some of what's really challenging the economy right now associated with early education and care. So I would say a lot of the framing around urgency And healing and stability and thinking about transformation is where we are. So what are we focused on right now? We have incredible capacity challenges in our field. Our license capacity is back to about 92% of what it was pre-COVID, but the staffed capacity is much lower. We have 30% turnover rates, average of 3 positions empty in fields. And every one of those closed classrooms are jobs that families aren't going back to or can't take because they can't find places to put their kids. So we're sort of urgently in the moment focused on capacity building and the urgent needs around staffing. How are we recruiting new people into the field? How are we creating supported pathways that give them opportunities to come in? How are we working with higher education to make it easy for them to access those things? And in the longer run, in terms of transformation, we have to really be thinking about the pathway for our early educators, how we make it a meaningful career path that I would be proud for my son to go into. And I think that's really not the case now. How do we make it a meaningful pathway that has supported entryways, meaningful growth along the way, and tied to decent, livable, family-sustaining wages, so that folks who love early childhood can stay in that field. Commissioner Riley and I were talking yesterday about how we might even work together to think about, there's often competition between our sectors. We see staff leaving our fields to go to the public schools, and how can we think together about career pathways that make sense for our staff in ways together. The other transformation that we really need to think about is the long-term financing. We know the field was really, our field was really strong. How's that? No. How's that? Okay. Our field was really struggling at the height of the pandemic, essentially in free fall, and we were able to do a lot of really important things at the agency, particularly through our Commonwealth Cares for Children stabilization grants. Those have been a game changer in terms of healing and stabilizing, and we are still very much in healing and stabilizing. But as we think about the future, the lessons learned about how we create a financing strategy in early childhood education that creates a stable, thriving sector where all of our working families have access to the programs that they need. The third big priority the agency has, so capacity and staffing in the immediate term, transformation in the long term for our staff, and the financing strategy for our field. But the big banana for us is affordability. And the immediate term, we are urgently working on reforms to our child care financial assistance system. About 52,000 families receive child care financial assistance to help pay to enroll in early education and care programs. That system has been difficult and complex and fraught with barriers, and we are working very hard to bring down those barriers in the short term to create a more modern, flexible, and dignified experience so that our job is to help people on their economic mobility path by helping them access. In the longer term, we have to think about what affordability looks like. We have, if not the most, one of the most expensive child care markets in the country. I think there's an article in the Globe today, in fact, about that. And so again, thinking about the long-term financing that creates a stable, well-financed sector, but also creates affordability so our working families can access programs across the Commonwealth at times and locations and in the settings that make the most sense for them. So those are our kind of pressing priorities in addition to kind of working closely with our colleagues.
Do we think the other mics are fixed? We'll run the mic. Good. So, well, Jeff, same question to you. What resonated with what you heard? What are your priorities, and where might you push back?
Yeah, I think I appreciate. Can you hear me? I could use my middle school principal voice. I think I appreciated the bifurcated nature of the presentation. We have to recover now, but also reimagine for the future. And when I think about what we've done at DESE, our focus has been on this kind of acceleration roadmap, which is this idea that we don't try to go back and remediate. Instead, we stay teaching on grade level and try to scaffold in those skills that kids may have missed. But also in that document, actually at the beginning of the document, we talk about fostering a sense of belonging. This idea that our kids have been disrupted significantly by being away from each other. and that kids need this sense of belonging. We need to get them back into a routine of learning, but we also need them to have that ability to socialize with each other. You know, basic Maslowian education is a kid has to have their housing be secure, they've got to be food secure, and they've got to have their mental health in a place where they're actually able to receive instruction. If any of those things are missing, a kid is not going to care about learning about slope of a line in first period algebra class. And we know we have kids that are dysregulated. So as we do recovery, we're talking about kind of our acceleration roadmap. That's for the now. But the other piece, the second part of the bifurcated piece, is what is the future? What are we going to do differently than we've done now? And I would argue for DESE, we're talking about deeper learning. This idea behind that is this idea of engagement. And it's talking about high quality curriculum. It's talking about tasks that are engaging and connected to the real world. It's stopping this vignette from happening in homes all across Massachusetts. And please play along with me for a second. Your kid comes home from school and you say to them, "How was school today?" And they say, "Fine or good, both acceptable." Very well done, very nice. What'd you learn today? Nothing. So imagine if we could, now some of that, listen, I totally understand, is just sullen teenager angst. But there's a little bit of truth to that too, because when you look at the data, kids are reporting being disengaged and more bored in class than ever before, especially as they get to high school. So we have to change that and create a space where kids are feeling more engaged, more excited about learning, and are seeing the connections between the real world that they're going to go into. And so that, I think, is our approach. I would also say behind all this, the scariest thing for me is that we've stayed number one on NAEP. Parents are reporting through surveys that they're pleased with the schools. But I think we're not seeing the urgency that we have to change the dynamic and make a better space for our kids. The reality is we've been flatlined on NAEP even before the pandemic for 15 years. And kids continue to report, "I don't want to go box to box every 45 minutes and be lectured at," particularly in high school. So that, I think, is we've got to kind of push past that and continue the urgency to reimagine where we're trying to go.
Thank you, Commissioner Riley. I'm always struck. I have a 13-year-old daughter. That's my older daughter in middle school. And I'm always struck by how she just goes about her day. A lot of it gives me concern. I'm not sure about it with the phone and the apps and all of that, but it is how she interacts with the world and how different it is compared to what she does in school and how she interacts with people there. Commissioner Ortega, same question to you. What are your priorities and where do you see opportunities?
Fantastic. And I think you can hear me from this mic. Is that the case? Fantastic. No? Yeah, all right, fantastic. I want to sort of start off because I think this is a great jumping point into the conversation, and I appreciate the way it's been framed today. There's a couple of things that I share in common with Commissioner Kershaw, and this is the idea that the provision of learning that I work with, higher education, very similar to the early ed space, it's not part of the entitlement conversation, if that makes any sense, right? K through 12 is something that is a constitutional requirement for all students. We've had debates about even populations that are immigrant and undocumented having access to that. But it doesn't necessarily translate over into the post-secondary space. The reason this is important, because when we think about trying to understand post-secondary access for all, it's a little bit difficult to sort of make the case and build understanding at why we have so many challenges in there tied to the idea of place, for example, but you can also fold into the other ideas as well, particularly time in the way that it's been framed out in this conversation. Our institutions are not ready for the learners that are coming into the universities, particularly when you think about post-secondary access for all. They traditionally have had mechanisms in place that do sorting, right, on who gets into our 2-year institutions, to our 4-year institutions, who's entitled to certain pathways through some sort of merit. And we've got to really figure out and which remains one of our top strategies to figure out how to turn the institution ready for the learners, right? The learner-ready idea, to pivot away from expecting that students just have the knowledge, skills, tools, and resources to succeed when they choose a post-secondary path, and figure out how are we going to meet them where they're at, and how are we going to create places that make them feel like these are institutions that they belong in as well, right? A couple of takeaways that I've had from the pandemic, and one of them is that in our scripts, in our texts, in our laws, in our guidelines, in our regulations, we've created some constraints that are really, really challenging, right? Things that commit us to parameters of time, for example, days, hours, credits, things that make innovation very difficult in a space like a classroom and learning environment. And until we figure out how to change those, to undo the scripts that guide the norming functions of our organizations, we're going to have a hard time achieving our primary goal of turning these organizations into learner-ready institutions. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges for us exist, right? Really understanding what are these norming functions that serve as barriers for our students as they come in, barriers that maybe inhibit the ability to produce human capital at the rates that's needed by our post-secondary institutions in all our fields, right, from early childhood all the way to the secondary space, in order to be able to meet students where they're at and provide them with the resources needed. I also reject the idea of returning to a normalcy, right, or even attributing the ideas that these problems are revelations that we achieved because of the pandemic. I went to schools that weren't serving people equitably, right? Particularly the Latino population that I was a part of in my community that was 98%. Those schools have existed for a very long time. It's now that we've shed light on the fact that this is now a universal problem. It's created equity gaps across a number of areas. And we can't lose sight of the fact that even though we've got to this situation in the way that we did, we cannot relinquish the idea that these interventions are needed across all our institutions to make sure that no one remains unserved by the system of higher education. So those are a few ways that higher education is entering the conversation, both from a human capital preparation standpoint, but also being prepared to receive students and meeting them where they are, particularly if we're going to buy into this access for all conversation in higher education, which we subscribe to at the agency.
Great, thank you. Appreciate your comments. I'm going to bounce around a little bit. I hope commissioners don't mind. Commissioner Riley, I want to come back to you first. And you mentioned deeper learning, and that often requires connecting to a partner or an expert, particularly if that learning might take place outside of the school. The Secretary mentioned how so often these wonderful opportunities are sort of add-ons or wraparounds. They don't ever fully get integrated into the school day. Can you comment on sort of the opportunity to better integrate schools with the communities around them and the opportunities that are presented?
So I'm not sure we've ever fully used our community partners in the maximum way that we could to leverage their skills, their expertise, whether that's through internships. Early college is certainly burgeoning, but we're still far from where we need to be. I think one of the most interesting and exciting programs for me recently is we did a pilot program to allow some of our high school seniors to basically give up the second half of their senior year and allow them to go down and work in schools, in elementary schools, for full credit and to get paid to do so. And while some of that is, trying to inspire people about education, some of that is also kind of like what happened during the world wars when they graduated doctors and nurses earlier because of the shortages, right? But this is found to be, from the kids' perspective, to be one of the most engaging things they've ever done in education, because they get to be part of the quote-unquote real world. I would also say when you talk about younger kids, and I don't want to exclude them from the conversation, we haven't done enough talking about high-quality enrichment and what that looks like as far as engaging kids. Because it may not show up on an MCAS test, but for a middle school kid to be involved in a play where there's complex directions, to get up in front of an audience of 500 or 1,000 people and sing a song, that shows up in real life. That's a skill, a demonstrable skill that can be used in real life. And yet, I'm not sure we're putting our thumb down on the scale enough for those kinds of opportunities.
Great. Thank you. I'll make note. My own daughter's school does Science Fridays. They may have stolen that from NPR, I'm not sure. But they just have a big block where there's open space to do exploration science with hands-on learning, and it's her favorite day of the week. Commissioner Ortega, if I come to you, Commissioner Riley mentioned early college. He also mentioned work-based learning. And I think in higher education, we often make the mistake of talking about college or career. And I'm struck by the fact that Rennie does a lot of early college work, and often those are geared around industry-specific opportunities, a criminal justice program, an early education program. Can you comment a little bit on how we can better braid college and career so we don't think of them as distinct pathways?
Sure. You know, I think a lot of work that's being done in the early college space really represents some things that are incubated ideas that we've got to figure out how to scale up and integrate into sort of the system of higher education at large. You know, and how we approach the weaving of ideas. For example, we do a lot to tie pathways to high priority careers in our society, right? And STEM is a perfect place where this is a good example. But I think we fall short sometimes of trying to really weave other applicable things in there that we're beginning to see as a society are missing, right? So I feel like we often refer to these as sort of the public good, collective good outcomes tied to thinking. When we think about professions, right? And I'll use the example of educator preparation as one that presents to me a lot of possibility. Often it's not framed from the idea of it being a social justice advocacy pathway, right? When it begins to really call attention to how educators provide young learners with frameworks for making sense of the events that are transpiring every single day around us, right? And I think when we approach and frame ideas in this way, broaden the idea of these structures tied to a career path, we'll invite a lot of more people to engage with that opportunity in a number of different ways that are more tied to things that are relevant where they are in that moment growing up as young learners, right? These are things that we've seen some educators do really, really well. For me, it was something that I saw happen in the extracurricular activities that I was involved in, right? I wasn't an athlete, but I was certainly in the music and arts opportunity, and I saw a lot of that being applied to sort of real life lessons of how I was being developed to be a better citizen in the society that I was going to exit through the means of the things that I like to engage in the particular art that I was studying at the time. And I feel like those are things that we've got to find ways to infuse into some of these pathways that will really draw a lot of more individuals in, right? Some people gravitate to the pathway I did early on when I was planning my post-secondary pathway because it really was the one transactional thing that made sense to me. And by transactional, I literally meant it had an earning potential that was better than the potential that I was accustomed and growing up with. And it became the magnet that drew me into a particular pathway. But along the way, there was a lot of other things I had to discover on my own because I did not have people who were tying that into the development, the career pathway. And I think that, to me, is the space where innovation can really, really broaden and enhance the early college experience to be that sort of catch-all that it has the potential, and I think many of us are recognizing it has the potential to do as well. So that's just one example, Chad.
Right. No, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Commissioner Kershaw, coming to you. You know, one of the things that always strikes me about the early education and care community, early childhood, is that it has a lot to offer to these questions. Partially that's due to how it's emerged, was often sort of as a non-system. So it's forced community connections, it's forced public-private partnerships. You know, can you share sort of what you see as some of the opportunities to sort of take full advantage of the community and some of the trade-offs and, you know, how you develop a more sustainable funding stream for early childhood education?
Sure, we'll try this one again. So I agree with you that early childhood education has a lot to push up into the other education systems, right? So if we think about time and place in early childhood, so early childhood education, we have this amazing, diverse, mixed delivery system from family child care providers to center-based programs that are in communities that respond to the cultural needs of the families they serve. And early childhood education, as a result, is an experience, not a physical location. And so you have an opportunity to build that experience in partnership with the community in a much broader way. And I think going to the urgent need to make sure we have the places for kids to be now and to the transform and focus is we also have an opportunity, I think, as we think about the future, how to make those spaces places that are supporting the behavioral and mental health challenges that we've seen so many kids facing in terms of their educational disruptions, but also connecting back to literacy and early literacy and how we're making sure that the spaces the kids are spending time in, that we are able to get the long-term investment and return on what we know early childhood education can do for third or fourth grade reading scores if we work together differently in those places. But time is another one that early education and care programs, okay. Collaborative approaches. Is this one on?
I think it is.
No.
Yep.
Always struggling to get the early education and, there we go. All right, always struggling to get the early education and care voice heard. We're gonna make sure it happens today. With the support of my colleagues, I'll note there. So on the time side, the thing I want to say about early education and care is like we have that kind of right too. I mean, not really, because we have so many families who are working non-traditional hours and in industries that start at times that don't necessarily work for our traditional, but we build around the family, right, in the early education and care space. So we were having a conversation yesterday too about after-school programs and how we have to make sure those meet the needs of the families, especially our working families. So early education and care has all of these, I think, what the experience is, how we make it diverse, how we connect to the cultural community, how we build equity within the communities and the economic communities in which we're working, and that we design our educational environments around the needs of our families, but also emergent learning and individualized learning, which is something we also do very well in early education. And yet we struggle because we are a system that doesn't have kind of a stable set of financing, right? So we have need-based assistance, like higher education, and we need to do a better job of reaching families so that they can afford. And then we have a need for structural financial support to ensure that those institutions exist within the community so families have access to them. And I think that's really, that feels to me like one of the biggest questions we have in addition to our workforce, which is what is that financing strategy that creates the kind of access and affordability that can support the economy and our young learners to hit those early reading milestones.
Great, thank you. One of the things that struck me in your comments was the notion of pushing up. I think often when we talk about making these types of transformative changes, for lack of a better way of saying it, we think horizontally, right? Because that's of the moment, that's the urgent need of now. How can a center or a school connect with its community and provide more programming? It's harder to think about, how do we connect early childhood to K-12 or early childhood to higher education to create pipelines for early educators, because that requires thinking about what's next and simply put, everyone's busy, right? So how do we build those connections across levels in our system to make a change? With that in mind, Commissioner Ortega, I want to come to you and have a little bit of the time we have left, make sure we talk about adults. And in particular, I think one of the places where higher education can play a role in thinking about transforming education is transforming our education workforce. And not only bringing more educators in the system, but helping to diversify the workforce and make sure that the adults working with students are more representative of their lived experiences and backgrounds. Can you share with us some thinking about how we might take steps to create a stronger pipeline into the education workforce?
Yeah, and just for the record, I haven't tested my ideas with both the Secretary and Commissioner Riley or Commissioner Kershaw. So I offer them off with a great deal of caution, but they're also informed by practices that you see happening in a number of different places, right? I think human capital challenges, particularly in the area of trying to figure out how to diversify the composition of the workforce, are extremely important. It strikes me often that when we're going through and thinking about strategies that address, let's say, the learning gaps that we've seen in the past couple of years, that the first one that doesn't always come to fruition or rise to the surface is the idea that changing the compositional diversity of our educator workforce yields different outcomes, right? Yields better outcomes. And it's a quick way to move into that doesn't have to rely on all the other strategies, which are still important, but need to be coupled with this idea. So for me, this is a really important idea that drives of why the post-secondary institutions need to do a better job to help resolve the human capital challenges that we find in that area. Then it became what happens in the classroom, right? The way that we're developing our educators, that is much more empowering and gives them more agency when they enter the classroom. These are ways that are more connected to culturally relevant, culturally responsive approaches to teaching and learning in the classroom. Things that tie into these changing the experience of young people in our classrooms in ways that do all the things that we've been talking about, drawing from community experiences, drawing from the lived experiences of students, and forging that into the lessons that are happening in our classrooms, right? So colleges need to do a better job in preparing. We've got to find ways to get rid of some of the age-old mechanisms that were meant to really select people out of the pathway. This is not the time that we had 20 or 30 years ago where you had all these individuals going into wanting to be educators. We have to change our approach to how we invite people into being admitted into programs, right? There's a lot of milestones, and I feel like educators have to overcome a lot more milestones than other professionals, right, that deter them. In fact, some people are choosing not to go into the profession because they do an assessment of what do I need to do along each of the ways that get me into the pathway, and that's a big problem because we can't not solve our human capital issues if those things continue to remain in place. I mentioned this before at the beginning of my remarks. We really have to take stock of what we're doing ourselves with regards to regulations and guidelines that prevent people from going into the pathway. And the other thing, and I think this was mentioned a couple of times, and Secretary Tutwiler touched on this, we just have to change the way that we talk about the profession. We've got to change the way that we create where we put up barriers people would not consider becoming an educator because the way that it's being talked about, not even, and not so much spaces like this, but in the public narrative, right? Where teachers are not being seen in the same light as they once were before, right? And certainly not educational leaders. You add that on top of all the expectations that are coming to our educators at the federal level, at the state level, and from the parents and communities they serve. This is a difficult profession to begin to attract people to, and we've got to change that. Educators are the ones, folks, that have an opportunity to interact with our young learners every single day and promote the profession in the ways that they approach learning in the classroom that invites people to want to go into that pathway. And we've got to do a better job of shedding light on those good things. And I think as post-secondary institutions, it's our job to help in the framing of this narrative and to get rid of any of the barriers that get in the way, right? At a later date, we can talk about assessments and what they assess and certifications in general, but nevertheless, I think these are beginning points because we are in a different context, right? We're thinking about education in the 21st century, and I feel a great deal of responsibility, as I'm sure my colleagues do here as well. We're putting the conditions in place that are going to drive learning for the next century. This is a huge responsibility. And I don't want for people to look back at the early part of the century in the way that sometimes we looked back at the early part of the previous century that we had the privilege of coming in at the tail end on and think, man, they missed the boat. They didn't know what they were doing. We've got to be better to step up and really put these pathways in place. And so for that's a commitment that we have in the Department of Higher Education, and I'm sure shared across the Executive Office of Education in a number of these things.
Right. Thank you. I mean, I want to state the obvious point that we need well-trained, high-quality educators in classrooms, but I think when we talk about alternative pathways, we often think of teachers having to walk into a school fully formed, and we know that in life that's not the case. I want to give an example from Lawrence, the Working Families Initiative that works with community members to become paraprofessionals, work in a classroom, then put them on a pathway where they could become teachers of record. Commissioner Kershaw, I don't want to leave out early education, make sure that we're elevating the voice. Obviously, being an early educator is a difficult position, and we know that they tend to be under-resourced and under-salaried. You know, do you have thoughts also on how we can better support the early educators in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to be talking about it along the continuum. So Commissioner Ortega's ideas about making the profession attractive, and I think in particular in early education, where you know, people are like, oh, I don't want to go into that profession, it's underpaid, it's not respected. We have work to do to elevate it to how awesome it is to work in early childhood education, what the benefits of working in it, and then to make that a valuable and meaningful pathway. There are some pretty cool new innovations happening around recruitment and retention, new apprenticeship programs that are creating these supported pathways in and supporting folks as they move in. Also in Lawrence, our parallel in the early childhood space, a mentor-mentee program where folks are being recruited and then mentored in the classroom, paid while they work, and as they move up the pathway, beginning to enter into the community colleges and stay on a pathway. So a lot of the same themes, I think, are what we need to do, which is elevate the field, recognize the value of working in it, make it easy to get in the field, but support them in the path while they're in that field to increase their skills and to stay in and see themselves through. Clearly, we have to talk about compensation too, and that goes back to the financing conversation, really how we think about, we implemented with the support of the legislature an historic rate increase for our subsidized or child care financial assistance programs. That starts to see an impact. Our Commonwealth Cares for Children program, which is putting about $450 million into stabilization grants into programs, we're starting to see in some age groups up to $2 increase in the wages per hour. So we're making incremental shifts and understanding the importance of sort of both of these levers. Funding into the hands of families to increase their purchasing power to access programs, and funding into the system and into the programs to support their financial stability and a well-compensated workforce. And we are in the heal and recovery stage of that. And we have work, I think, to do to think about how we get from heal and recovery, kind of I would say we're sort of holding on by our fingernails, into a much more transformative way of thinking about a stable field and an elevated workforce and a career pathway that makes sense. So thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Riley, I want to round out the conversation by making sure we also mention current educators. And I think Alexis made the point, which is worth elevating again. I think often in these conversations, if you're a teacher in a classroom, you sort of hear, oh, this is more stuff to do, and I have to plan it, and no one's going to give me additional support. So how do we support current educators?
So, 30 years ago when I was a teacher, I started teaching in Baltimore City, there were all these professional development conferences that I could go to and basically steal great ideas from other teachers. And we've gotten away from that. Teachers would walk over broken glass to get something that they could bring back to their classroom, and yet we don't give them the opportunities or the support to really have those conversations. We built a system which is important, right? Test scores are accountability, that stuff is important, but I think we need to get back to focusing on our teachers, who we haven't supported long enough. I think that starts with giving them the foundation of high-quality curriculum materials, and in our early grades, making sure they understand the science of reading. But once the teachers have that foundation, we've got to turn our people loose, because they have amazing abilities to make lessons better. They have new great ideas that can be brought into their classrooms. And at this time, it feels like we're tying one hand behind our teachers' backs. And so how do we get to a place where everyone has that strong foundation, but then we trust the teachers? I would argue we probably have the best teaching force, pre-K through college, in the country. And yet we've never given them the support they need. So in K-12, I think that's where we want to go.
Great. Thank you. And I appreciate the comments by all our commissioners. Unfortunately, we are at time. It's a nice concluding thought. It allows me to share. That is our hope here at the Rennie Center. If you go into the past reports, go into this year's retrospective, it's not about a bunch of ideas from the top to put on educators in the system to do. It's looking at what they're already doing and how it is transforming learning environments and how we can share them across settings so other people have access to them. So thank you very much. We appreciate the time of our three commissioners. Thank you, everyone, for coming today.